Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for today's event. We call it America's Unfinished Business, an LGBTQ Summit. June is Pride Month, and today we're going to be exploring the impacts of hard-fought wins and the road still ahead for some of the issues most affecting LGBTQ communities across the country and, frankly, across the world. We've got a spectacular lineup of speakers joining us this afternoon, but before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Capital One and Philip Morris International, for their support of today's conversations. Recent years have unquestionably seen advancements in rights and protections for LGBTQ+ Americans, from marriage equality to last June's landmark Supreme Court decision preventing employers from firing LGBTQ+ identifying employees on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But there's so much more work to be done. Even as the Equality Act clears the House and heads to the Senate for a vote, hundreds of anti-LGBT bills have been introduced in state legislatures this year. What then is the outlook for LGBTQ+ protections at the federal and state levels? And what additional advancements in visibility and representation should we be seeking? We're going to be putting these questions and many more in front of our fantastic lineup of speakers. But first, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillLGBTQ. I wish we had a plus there, but we'll just go The Hill LGBTQ. We're broadcasting live, and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, it could go haywire. Just push refresh, and they say it will fix everything. Never does for me, but I'm sure it will for you. My first guest is Congressman Richie Torres from New York. He made history as the first gay Afro-Latino person elected to Congress, and he now chairs the Congressional LGBTQ+ Equality Caucus. Congressman Torres, great to talk to you, and thank you for joining us. Let me just tell our audience a little bit about the district in the Bronx you come. I did not know that it was the poorest district in terms of income in the United States. And for you to have achieved the things you did, I mean, I've been reading up all about the struggles you've dealt with. $100 million golf course created across the street from where you lived when you didn't have dependable water, heat, etc. I just want to know, and I want to kind of and you add your identity on top of that. And so it's kind of a success story in a weird way. But as you hear other people struggling with circumstances they're in, and they may be struggling with their LGBTQ+ identity, what kind of counsel would you give them?
Well, I would tell them you have to be who you are. I see coming out as a gift, because the process of coming out, the integrity that it demands from you, is an ethic of radical authenticity. And those of us who have chosen to come out, who have chosen to be who we are living life with greater authenticity and integrity, which not only matters when it comes to your sexuality, but it matters when it comes to the fullness of your overall life. As you said, I was born and raised in the Bronx. Nothing was ever handed to me on a silver platter. I had to fight for everything I have in my life. I was raised by a single mother who had to raise 3 children on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was a mere $4.25. And I grew up in molded and leaking conditions in public housing. And as you referenced, my life is something of a metaphor. I actually grew up in a public housing development right across the street from what ultimately became Trump Golf Course. And as I saw the conditions in my own home get worse every day, the government had invested more than $100 million in a golf course for Donald Trump. And I remember asking myself at the time, what does it say about our society that we're willing to invest more in a golf course than in the homes of low-income Black and brown New Yorkers in public housing? And so that experience of inequality in the shadow of Trump Golf Course is what inspired me to get my start in politics as a housing organizer.
I appreciate that. And, one of the areas we're going to be talking a lot about today is that while there have been achievements, while the Equality Act has passed in the House, we see this rise of basically, in my book, bigoted legislation, efforts around the United States to, curb transgendered rights. We also see an absolutely alarming increase in the rise of the highest level of deaths against transgendered and non-binary people in our history this past year. And yesterday we did a program with The Hill on mental health and COVID, but one of the things we talked about, the Trevor Project found that 40% of young LGBTQ+ students have thought about suicide. And so you just sort of feel the stress and tension there on all those fronts. And I'm just wondering, and I know it's unfair, but as you look at the LGBTQ plus caucus, which you help co-chair, what's on their agenda that really matters? I mean, we have bright colors behind us, but they're not bright colors in a lot of people's lives. So I'm just sort of interested in as you look at it as a legislator now, what do we need to be aware of in terms of rectifying and helping some of these people that are dying?
Well, the highest priority of the LGBTQ caucus, the holy grail of LGBTQ equality, is the Equality Act. So the Equality Act would expand the scope of the Civil Rights Act to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination. The Equality Act is based on a simple proposition that no one should be fired or evicted or denied critical services or accommodations simply because of who you are or whom you love. Everyone is entitled to equal protection under the law, regardless of your sexual orientation and gender identity. Back in 2015 in New York State, we had a statewide lobby for the LGBTQ community known as the Empire State Pride Agenda. And in December of 2015, several months following the Obergefell decision, the lobby chose to close shop, declaring that its mission had been accomplished. And that press release was met with a ferocious backlash. And for me, that demonstrates that we have to be careful in a post-Obergefell world not to prematurely declare mission accomplished, not to take for granted the inevitability of progress. We have to recognize that marriage equality is only one component of legal equality, and legal equality is only one component of LGBTQ equality, overall LGBTQ equality. Even if we were to pass the Equality Act, there will continue to be LGBTQ elders who face among the highest rates of isolation and depression. There will continue to be LGBTQ youth who are bullied at school by their own peers, who are evicted from their homes by their own parents. And LGBTQ youth face disproportionately high rates of housing insecurity and homelessness, suicidal ideation, and suicide. As you noted, the Human Rights Campaign has reported the highest number of murders against members of the trans community, particularly trans people of color, in the history of the organization. So we have to be careful not to declare mission accomplished and to make progress on all these fronts.
Do you find, we're going to be talking to some folks that have been doing some bipartisan work, but as you're up in Congress now, and you've succeeded, so significantly, I think there are now 9 LGBTQ plus members in the House. But how is it going with Republican colleagues? Are you finding common ground with them, both on these sort of Equality Act issues in any way, but on other issues? I saw you in your Twitter feed with President Biden about the child tax credit and various things. Sometimes, these human moments, whether it's on mental health or dealing with COVID crisis or something, create opportunities for folks across the aisle to find, that they're both human on each side of this. And has that helped on any of the LGBTQ plus efforts as far as you've seen in the House?
Quite the contrary. What I've seen is Republicans are doubling down on the culture wars. I vividly remember the Republican Party under George W. Bush running in 2004 on a platform of opposing marriage equality through various referenda across the country. And I feel like we're witnessing a revival of those culture wars. The difference between then and now is that the new culture wars are specifically targeting the trans community, right? Since transphobia remains more socially acceptable than homophobia, the Republicans are waging a cynical campaign of scapegoating and spear-mongering that specifically demonizes the trans community. I've heard Republicans in Congress portray the Equality Act as an existential threat to womanhood, to female athletics, to religious liberty. Republicans falsely claiming that if we pass the Equality Act, it's going to lead to rapes and assaults in bathrooms. So if anything, the rhetoric of Republicans have become much more transphobic, much more hyperbolic, much more vitriolic. Instead of progressing, the Republican Party is doubling down on transphobia.
You were the youngest member of the New York City Council. You're one of the youngest people in there. I was happy to be at a Pride event last night with Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, who was there to show her support and come in. And she's also one of the youngest members of the House today. And I'm just wondering, I mean, just kind of get inside, Gen Zers and millennials' heads as they're kind of looking at this scene. Are you folks hopeful with what's going on? Are you frustrated with the way the legislative process works and the kind of deal making it takes and the stalls that you see in places in the Senate? I'm just interested because I've known generations of senators and House members a long time, and I just love to kind of get in your head for a minute and see what how it all looks to you folks. Congresswoman Underwood is very, very positive. He's doing a lot on health care, child credit, been very supportive of LGBTQ plus community. But I'm interested in whether the process itself to you seems healthy or broken.
Look, I'm optimistic out of necessity, right? There would be no reason for me to serve in Congress unless I thought I could make a difference, unless I thought I could have an impact in improving people's lives. Having said that, our democracy is broken. In a properly functioning democracy, policies that have the support of the majority of the American people, that have the support of the president, that have the support of legislative majorities in the Senate and the House, would become law. But what we have is nothing resembling a functioning democracy. We live under the tyranny of the filibuster. The filibuster has made the Senate a graveyard for vital legislation such as the Equality Act. And that is the greatest source of frustration, is there's no real ability to govern boldly, largely because of the obstructionism that the filibuster represents. And there are those who attempt to advance a romanticized vision of the filibuster as the best hope for bipartisanship. There is no evidence that the filibuster has given us bipartisanship. Quite the opposite. It's given us nothing but glorified gridlock. And if we want to start governing more effectively in the service of LGBTQ equality, we have to either reform or abolish altogether the filibuster.
Oh, fascinating. I guess, I just ask, one other thing is you kind of look at the heat we've gone through. So we're coming out, it seems, of the most intense parts of the pandemic. We saw what happened in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and, frankly, the murder of many other Black and brown Americans. We're talking about the death of many transgender citizens in this country. And I have to say, I mean, this is my own editorial comment, I wonder and I fear if we're going to lose not make the progress we should have made in these intense moments on dealing with racial bigotry, on dealing with homophobic bigotry and other sorts of divides. That we had a kind of moment where this was all we talked about and we saw that tension. And I'm just wondering, do you think we have the momentum in Congress? Do you have the momentum in your caucus to keep the priority of civil rights and justice high and not just a function of an incident that happened? Because I feel it slipping. I'm not sure what you think.
Look, we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I think you have every right to be vigilant. But there's no question that we're progressing. And one example is the Supreme Court's decision in the Bostock case, which was ironically written by Neil Gorsuch. But the Supreme Court held that Title VII's prohibition against employment discrimination based on sex applies to sexual identity and gender, sexual orientation and gender identity. The Supreme Court pointed out the obvious, that you cannot discriminate based on sex without discriminating. So you cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity without inherently discriminating based on sex. And so the Biden administration has applied the revolutionary logic of the Bostock decision to enact a whole panoply of administrative rules prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So there is a Bostock revolution unfolding as we speak. And that to me represents a real breakthrough for LGBTQ equality. It's no substitute for the Equality Act, but it's a bona fide breakthrough.
Well, Representative Richie Torres of New York, yeah, I assume your mom is still with us. Your mom, I just following your story, the tweets, your mom sounds like an incredible lady. Would love to interview her and get her on this show one day, and just sounds like you've just really, really done incredible things already at a very young point in your life. So Representative Richie Torres, thank you so much, co-chair of the Congressional LGBTQ Plus Equality Caucus. Thanks for joining us today.
Take care.
My next guest is Leslie Newman, author of more than 75 books. I'm going to say that again, 75 books for readers of all ages. Her most famous work, perhaps, is the groundbreaking Heather Has Two Mommies. It was one of the first children's books to portray lesbian families in a positive, in a normal, in an accepted, I don't even like the word normal, but in a light where we are fully inclusive, painting this world that we're talking about today. She's continued to tell LGBT stories throughout her career in works like October Morning and A Song for Matthew Shepard, and her book, Sparkle Boy. Welcome, Leslie. It's a real honor to talk to you, and I've known your books for ages. I don't think we've ever met or talked, and I wondered where all these were coming from. But it's not been an easy journey for you to tell these stories, too. I'm just sort of interested in one, as you've kind of built this incredible array of storytelling and helping people to see themselves in these stories, can you tell me a little bit about how hard it was from the pushback as well in the communities you were trying to impact?
Well, Heather Has Two Mommies came out in December of 1989, so that's a long time ago now, and things were very different back then. So back then, there was all kind of vitriol aimed at me, hate mail, very bad experiences on talk shows, political upsets. But now it seems that the books are very quietly finding their way where they need to go, and being accepted more and being read in classrooms all over the country, being bought for libraries. So there's been a real shift. We still have a long way to go, obviously, but it's been quite an amazing journey all these decades.
Do you think, when it comes to our transgender citizens, yesterday we did a program at The Hill on mental health, COVID, and the challenging times we're in, and we had Dr. Rachel Levine, who had been Secretary of Health in the state of Pennsylvania. She is now the most senior transgender official as Assistant Secretary of Health in the Department of Health and Human Services. And when we had that, I have to say some of the most horrific things I saw online come in with bigoted, intolerant, just awful comments came up, and I've been 3 or 4 times. I admire her bravery, but I'm just wondering, do you see a pathway where transgender stories become part of the world that people like you write about? And will that help normalize this challenge they're feeling?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by people like you when you're talking to me.
Well, I mean writers, storytellers that have. I guess what I mean is you have helped people normalize and see the world as it should be. And right now there are a lot of people who don't have that. So that's why I admire you. So I was actually saying people like you, you're a storyteller who can help people understand and feel and see what the benefits are of a truly inclusive world and society.
Well, books that feature trans characters for young readers are already being written and published. For example, When Aiden Became a Brother by Kyle Lukoff is a wonderful book, Jack Not Jackie. And then there are also books about kids who maybe don't identify as transgender, but are challenging gender norms, like I Love My Purse, my own book, Sparkle Boy, Annie's Plaid Shirt. So we definitely need more books that challenge gender stereotypes, that celebrate gender creative people, and they are happening and they will continue to happen. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of them and to being a part of that.
Leslie, can you also share with our audience the 2 other books? So one A Song for Matthew Shepard, this collection of poems and stories, and I know that you know Matthew Shepard's parents, whom I was honored to meet and interview many years ago. It was one of the most moving experiences and interviews of my life, candidly, but also October Morning.
So
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Show and tell.
Yeah, they're the same, but I mean, yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yes, October Morning, a song from Matthew Shepard. I'm an author. I can't help just holding up my book for a minute.
I'm glad you're doing it.
So I was the keynote speaker in 1998 for Gay Awareness Week at the University of Wyoming. Matt planned on attending my lecture. He was part of the planning committee. He was attacked 5 days before that lecture, never made it to that lecture, died the morning that I arrived at the University of Wyoming. So my book explores the impact of this horrendous hate crime in a poetic way, because I'm a poet, by telling the story through many, many different voices, starting with the fence. So I feel like my job as a writer is to give voice to the voiceless. And Matt's voice was stolen from him. And so I use everything around him to tell the story, such as the fence speaking. The fence was an innocent bystander who became part of this crime. The witnesses, such as the moon that watched over him, the stars that watched over him, a deer that came by and kept him company throughout the night, fictitious people like townspeople, and actual people like his parents and himself. So, and through this work of mine, I have become very good friends with Judy and Dennis Shepard, who are my heroes, absolutely. I've never met anyone like them. They're the kindest, most generous, most passionate, most committed people I know, who work so hard every day in every way to make the world a better place and a safer place for all.
Another one of your collections is A Letter to Harvey Milk, which I haven't read or seen yet, but I would love to have you share with us, because I want to go with that. I think the story of Harvey Milk is one of the things we're raising today, is that Harvey Milk's message was, let your neighbor know you're gay or lesbian, you're out, that the presence out there. It's one of the things where we were talking about mental health yesterday, is every one of us probably have someone where mental health challenges are part of the scene and picture we're in. And so sometimes it takes encouragement, empathy, support for people to come out. But I would love to know more what you would share with our audience that the Harvey Milk letters are about.
So it's the short story, A Letter to Harvey Milk, is told as a diary written by a 77-year-old Holocaust survivor who, unbeknownst to him, becomes friends with a Jewish lesbian who is teaching a creative writing class at his senior center. And so through the course of the story, they both get to know each other better. And the narrator, Harry Weinberg, has memories that are unearthed that he's been pushing down for decades. And the other protagonist of the story, the Jewish lesbian, looks at herself and what it means to live an authentic life and what it cost her in terms of her relationship with her family and what she gains from it. So it's those two kind of parallel stories coming together.
Before we go,
but
Leslie,
I think, one other thing is that many people, whether they're part of the LGBTQ plus community or in other ways, have had challenges in terms of living their authentic life, not feeling safe to do so, having to hide themselves. And, as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I know directly how painful that is, and what it costs you, and how freeing it is to be your authentic self. And so I feel like my job as a writer and as a human being, really, is to do what I can to make the world a safer place so we can all be who we are and be respected and accepted and celebrated, and not tolerated. I don't really like that word. I tolerate a bad hair day, perhaps,
right,
or something. But I don't tolerate people. I accept, celebrate, and respect them.
Leslie, let me just ask you finally, and I completely agree that I think that the bigotry, the bias that is out there needs a response. And I hope one day that the stories that you outline tell the story, the world that has become, that has evolved towards that. But I know we're not there yet. I know whether it's on dealing with race, it's dealing with discrimination across these issues, that there's so much more work that needs to be done. But there's also a path. So we're talking to a lot of political people today. At one point it was about same-sex marriage. Another time it's about transgender rights in various areas. But as a writer, is there something on the horizon that you think is the next step that's important to sort of try to achieve the next step, both in, I don't like the words tolerate, acceptance either, normalization for all of us? I mean, what do you see as the next challenge as an artist and writer that you think we should explore?
Well, that's a tough one. I think basically we need to just keep going in the direction that we are going, which is inclusivity across the board, inclusivity of sexuality, gender expression, racial equality, body size is another one, ability and disability. Just, I think we all need to work together in coalition so that at some point maybe we won't even need any of these labels because we'll just all be human beings. That's what I'm striving for.
Well, I love that. Leslie Newman, author of Heather Has Two Mommies, such a groundbreaking work, and 72 other books, including A Letter to Harvey Milk and October Morning, A Song for Matthew Shepard. I read that a Letter to Harvey Milk is now an off-Broadway play. Is it still? Well, I mean, I know everything's shut down, but are they planning to bring it back to New York? Because I'm going to go see it.
Fabulous. Yes, I'm very hopeful. It had a nice run and then an extended run. And I got to see it with my parents before they passed, which was so emotional and moving for me. And I do hope that it does come back and continues to have a life. It's a very moving piece of work.
Well, Leslie and Newman, thank you so much for taking us on this journey and sharing with us these books. And very grateful that you fought to make sure they are on our shelves.
Thank you.
And now for a message from our sponsor, Capital One. Please welcome Roldy Leva, Managing Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Capital One. He's in conversation with Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roldy Leva, and I'm Managing Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, or what we call DIB here at Capital One. At Capital One, we remain dedicated to fostering an inclusive workplace for all associates. The commitment to our people, this isn't new for us. In fact, it dates back to our founding, and it's deeply embedded in our values. And it's certainly true with regards to our commitment to LGBTQ plus inclusion, especially as we observe LGBTQ plus Pride Month this June. Dating back to 1997, in fact, our domestic partners and same-sex spouses have been eligible for fertility, surrogacy, and adoption assistance. And beyond our walls, we support policy efforts like the Equality Act to advance critical protections and equality for the LGBTQ plus community. We believe it's our responsibility to continuously advocate for an equitable and inclusive society where everyone feels empowered to be themselves and has the opportunity to thrive. And it's in that spirit, then, that it is my pleasure to talk today with Senator Sarah McBride, who represents the 1st State Senate District of Delaware. And so, Sarah, thank you for being with us here today. And I'd love it if you could just maybe take a second to tell us a bit about yourself and how your journey led you into politics.
Sure. Well, first off, it's great to join you and to join Capital One on the Hill for this conversation. In many ways, my journey to politics is rooted in my own journey to authenticity. Because at a young age, even before realizing that I wasn't alone, that there was something I could do about this, I was becoming very aware of the fact that I was living in a world that wasn't necessarily built to embrace and accept someone like me. And growing up, as I began to understand who I am, and as I learned that I'm not alone, I saw very clearly that there was still discrimination, violence, and significant prejudice facing the LGBTQ community. And as a young person, I feared that my dreams and my identity, my dreams of finding love, of living in a community I love and doing work that I love, were mutually exclusive with my identity as a transgender person. I got involved in politics and advocacy and government first, wondering that if perhaps I helped to bring about change and to build a world where more people could live openly and authentically, that could help compensate for me living a life in the closet. And then eventually, when I came out, wanting to build a world where the positive experiences that I had were no longer a privilege for the few, but a right guaranteed to everyone, no matter their gender identity or their sexual orientation. And so I got involved in advocacy, and then eventually ran for public office. But I think more than my own journey as a trans person, the experience for me that informed both my advocacy and now informs me as an elected official was the experience with my husband, Andy, coming to this work and coming to this effort, not just as a trans person, but someone who's loved someone who's trans. I met Andy, who was a transgender man fighting for equality. He was about 3 years older than me. And about a year or so into our relationship, he was diagnosed with cancer. He was lucky enough to have insurance. We were lucky enough to have a job that allowed both of us to focus on his health. He got a clean bill of health and then received the news that his cancer was terminal. And after we were able to get married, just 4 days after that, he passed away. And for me, that experience changed me in really profound ways. Andy taught me how to love and be loved. He taught me how to live the values I fight for at work in my own life. But more than anything else, my relationship with him underscored for me that change cannot come fast enough, that every time we ask LGBTQ people to sit back and allow for a slow conversation to take place before we treat them with dignity and ensure them opportunity, we are asking people to watch their one life pass by without the respect and fairness that everyone deserves. And so with that sense of urgency, with the deep desire to bring about change that allowed me to face the hardship and the challenges of coming out, of facing Andy's illness, and also with a profound sense of optimism and hope that I think we as a community have seen over the last decade, and certainly since the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, with that sense of hope, that sense of urgency, I decided to run for office. And now I'm incredibly lucky to have the opportunity to serve the district that I was born and raised in as a state senator.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing so openly of your story and for sharing Andy's story. And I'm sorry for your loss. And so much of what you shared really resonated with me, because it is at the heart of why we do this work. In fact, it's why we added the word belonging to this work. And as the head of this function at Capital One, we know that building diverse and inclusive teams is a priority. Representation matters. But the North Star really is about belonging. It's about everyone feeling safe and seen and heard and valued and able to thrive as their best, most authentic selves. You never really belong if you feel as though if you make conscious decisions about who you choose to be in the workplace or in your environment because you don't feel safe living your true self. And so that's why that's so important for us. We all identify across a range of identities. I, for instance, identify as Latino, as Cuban, as white, cisgender male, openly gay, among a number of others. As you reflect on your own range of identities, and particularly reflecting on the intersection between them and your role as an elected official, how would you characterize what belonging means to you? And how do you think that public policy can serve as a lever for helping more people feel a sense of belonging?
I think belonging is one of the most profound, not just needs, but desires and that we have as people. I think it's one of the most fundamental human emotions that we have, is that desire to be seen, to be loved, and to find community. And one of the challenges we face when we're talking about trans rights is that most people who are cisgender, who are not transgender, do not have a similar experience to being trans and in the closet. And your comment about belonging, I think, in many ways touches on what I always have described as what it felt like to be in the closet, which was a constant feeling of homesickness, an unwavering ache in the pit of my stomach that would only go away when I could be seen and affirmed as myself. Ultimately, that's what the fight for equality is about, to be able to find home, to be able to find a place of peace and security, of fellowship, of love, of comfort in our world, in our workplaces, in our schools, in our families, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. It's not just government. Legal equality is not the end of the road. It doesn't transform automatically in totality into lived equality, but government can set a foundation. Government can create policies that help to facilitate a sense of belonging, that can help to facilitate a sense of safety and security, that sense of home. And they can send a message. When our laws include an individual, when they include a community, it sends a message not just to that community, but to the country writ large, to the state writ large, to the city writ large, that this community is part of the fabric of our humanity, the fabric of our community, and part of our diversity.
Indeed. And one of the things I love so much about belonging is that it's universal. It's in our humanity. We all know a time when we have felt as though we belonged and when we haven't. And we should all be advocating for people to be able to belong. That it's at the heart of the work that we do. And so just, thank you for your work and for your advocacy in that space. Shifting gears just a little bit, reflecting on last year. 2020 was an extraordinary year on a number of fronts. Our nation grappled with issues like systemic racism and inequality, unlike any other time, certainly in my lifetime that I can remember. How would you perceive the role of government to lead more equitable outcomes for all diverse and underrepresented groups, inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community?
One of my favorite quotes, and frankly, one of the quotes that to me is part of my governing philosophy, is the quote by Audre Lorde, which is that there's no such thing as a single issue cause because no one lives single issue lives. I think there are a few issues that encapsulate that more than actually addressing the epidemic facing Black transgender women who live at the intersection of transphobia, latent homophobia, misogyny, and systemic racism. Their lives, their experiences, and the epidemic that they face reinforce that in the fight for equality, we can't just begin and end with policies like non-discrimination protections or marriage equality. That it's got to include meaningful economic empowerment programs, putting money and funding behind the types of programs that are connecting trans people with jobs. It means reforming the criminal justice system to repair trust and ensure that it is able to uphold the dignity and protect the safety of everyone in our community. Because right now, the violence that trans women of color are facing, it's not just based in hate in people's hearts, it's also based in hate that exists throughout society and in many cases in our laws. Because what is happening right now is that transgender people, particularly Black transgender women, are being pushed out of stable employment, stable housing, onto the streets, into underground economies, and out of society's traditional mechanisms for safety and security. And the only way to address that, the only way to create true lived equality for everyone in our community is to recognize that Audre Lorde quote, that we need to meet our progress on non-discrimination policies and marriage equality with progress on a whole host of issues, because all of those issues at the end of the day intersect with the LGBTQ community. And I do believe that government has not just a unique responsibility, but a unique opportunity to lead, because it is the place where every avenue of society converges.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm reminded of an old African proverb that I often share with my team, which is to go fast, you go alone, but to go far, you go together. And I think that there's a real space for government to affect real meaningful change, but to create lasting, enduring, meaningful change, I think it requires all of us, right? It requires government, the private sector, and individuals coming together to put forth a collective effort. So, Sarah, thank you. I want to thank you for spending some time with us today and sharing so much of you and your story and your work. We appreciate your time and more broadly, your work to advocate for diverse communities across the country. So thank you. Be well and stay safe.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Roldy and Sarah, what a great conversation. Thank you both so much for that. Many, many lessons in that, particularly about belonging, but also not living single issue lives. I mean, it's fascinating matrix we just heard. My next guest is a pioneer in American government, Governor Kate Brown of Oregon, who made history in 2016 as the first openly LGBT and first bisexual person to be elected governor, any governor in the United States. Governor Brown, it's great to see you. Thank you. I know you have a lot cooking in Oregon right now, and we're very honored that you took some time during Pride Month to sort of talk to us a little bit about your journey, and which I want to get into. And I know that you being outed and then elected was not necessarily the order that you might have selected to come in. But before I get into that, I'm just interested in kind of get a template right now as you look at our civil rights challenges looking forward in the state of Oregon, your citizens, the questions of inclusion. What's high in your mind right now?
Well, we're continuing to make progress here in the state of Oregon. I am extremely fortunate to have a legislature that is dominated by progressives that believe in true equality for the entire LGBTQIA community. And so we work in partnership to continue to change the laws and ensure that, at least from a legal perspective, that Oregon is a state where everyone, regardless of how they identify, can achieve their full potential.
You know, to help our audience understand, and I just find it fascinating, in the mid-1990s, the Oregonian outed you and other legislators, as I understood, in this process, and as bisexual, and you went on and you just said, fine, we're going to just continue to do the people's business, and you were elected governor of the state. I guess my question and almost my hope is this almost becoming a non-issue? Or I know it's not a non-issue, but is the issue of who we are becoming embraced enough that we don't have to worry about those kinds of outings anymore?
I think that's true in Oregon for the most part. I will say it is certainly true that my sexual orientation has been used against me and, frankly, against other candidates. A real clear example of that was several years ago, I was working hard to be the Senate president, the state Senate president. And in my role as majority leader, as the caucus leader, was working to elect Democratic candidates to the state Senate. I remember being told by one of the communities that the rumor mill was, if you elect this person as our senator, then Kate Brown, who is a lesbian bisexual, horror of horrors, will become the Senate president. Obviously don't know what a lesbian bisexual is, but so clearly it has been used not only against me, but other candidates. But I do know we had a woman, first lesbian, run as an openly gay person for the Oregon Supreme Court in 2006. I know from polling at that time that Oregonians simply just didn't care. They were concerned about her ability to do the job and her qualifications, and I think that's how it should be.
Well, one other element, I was reading an interview with you, and I apologize if I get any of this wrong, but it made me think about whether or not we have empathy problems within the LGBT community. It often doesn't get discussed, but this is an editorial program. Years ago, I interviewed Andrew Sullivan, who's provocative and was making a provocative statement, and I disagree, everyone, with the statement he said. But he said, Steve, the L's don't like the G's don't like the B's don't like the T's. There is really not, and it raised this interesting question, which is while there is a collective concern over civil rights, there sometimes has been a disregard and a diffidence between different communities. And I was fascinated that your parents just wanted you to be lesbian, or that other friends of yours within other communities wanted you not to be bisexual. And I just sort of think this may be a moment of introspection where we can all learn a little bit about accepting within our community who we are. Am I on the right track on that?
Well, here's what I would say. And just to clarify, one of my parents said it would be easier for us to understand if you were lesbian. And at that time, bisexuality was seen as a choice. I obviously disagree with that. It is who I am. And I think we have a better understanding of bisexuality and pansexuality today. In terms of the community, though, I have to tell you my experiences, both in working in the legislative arena in the state capitol, where back in 2005 and 2007, we were absolutely adamant that our legislation to prohibit discrimination should include the entire LGBTQI community, that we were not going to leave behind our trans brothers and sisters. So that is true there. And I have to tell you my experiences in terms of running for office. The Victory Fund embraced me and my sexual orientation. They were absolutely the reason why I won my first statewide Democratic primary. They came in early. They supported my candidacy. Chuck Wolf, who was president of Victory Fund at the time, said, if we support Kate Brown as Secretary of State, It could happen that when the governor resigns, she could become the first LGBTQ governor in the country. Ironically enough, that's exactly what happened. So my experiences have been positive. I see us working here as a community and working to protect our fellow brothers and sisters, and ensure that we can all achieve our full potential, that we can all thrive, that we can all have a sense of belonging and a strong sense of community.
I love that. I love Chuck Wolf, and I remember when he was leading the Victory Fund. And I'll tell our audience, you should go back. Victory Fund also did a lot with leaders not only supporting the United States. I remember moderating forums with really great, outstanding heroes from Brazil and Ecuador, Turkey, other places in the world that were fighting, putting their lives on the line to kind of create acceptance and to create inclusion in their countries and to kind of fight for political rights. It was really, really impressive what they've done not only in the United States but also globally. Let me just ask Governor as well. We now have a Governor, Jared Polis, who has succeeded, also come in after you. We have a Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Last evening, I got to meet one of my heroes, is Dr. Rachel Levine, who is the highest level transgender person in the Biden administration. She is Secretary of Health in the Department of Health and Human Services. She was an outstanding physician general and a Secretary of Health in the state of Pennsylvania. And so I'm just wondering, I know that these are still just a few sprouts, but do you think we're tilting the right direction? And do you think the entire country, as opposed just to the progressive wing, is acclimating to the reality that we are all here and we're going to be part of the equation?
Well, I can't say the entire country, but I can say certainly the majority at this point in time. What I can say about all of these role models is that it's so incredibly important for our young people to see the diversity of the LGBTQIA community in positions of power. You cannot be what you cannot see. And it's so important for young people to see heroes and role models. I remember when I was sworn in as the first openly bisexual governor in the state of Oregon, I remember getting a letter from a young person in Indiana. And by virtue of my presence, I am confident that that young person is still alive today. They wrote to me and said, "You are the reason I am still alive and willing to go on living." And I just think it's incredibly important for kids to see role models like Secretary Buttigieg, like Governor Jared Polis. It's just amazing. I also think it's really important for there to be a diversity of voices at the leadership table. That can be at the local level, at the city council or a school board. It can be at the state level, statewide elected officials. It also needs to be absolutely at the national level. But when you have a diversity of voices, a diversity of perspectives at the leadership table, the decisions made are much more respectful. They are much more reflective of the community. And as a result, they are much more likely to be resilient for the long term.
Governor, real quick, I've got Casey Suffredini coming on in a moment of Freedom for All Americans, works a lot with businesses and works across the aisle. I'm just interested, as you kind of interact with your business leaders in the state, you talk about workplaces, you talk about what a healthy community is. Do they come to you for advice and counsel? Do you think they're moving in the right direction in Oregon?
Absolutely. Well, we've got some great companies, and they are absolutely committed to full equality for the entire LGBTQIA community. A great example of that is Nike. Their folks stood shoulder to shoulder with me and other legislators as we worked to pass the non-discrimination bill and our domestic partnership bill. And they believe very much in the importance of equality and justice for all of their employees and for their customers as well. And that partnership, these types of partnerships are crucial if we want to continue to move forward. We have to see a public effort, but the public effort also is helped by the private sector as well.
Well, Governor Kate Brown, I really liked what Senator Sarah McBride from Delaware said a few minutes ago, where she said, you know, we don't live single issue lives. You know, this is one slice of it. There are lots of other issues that lay over. So this was wonderful with you, and I hope you will come back to talk about many of the other issues that you're dealing with. We'd love to have you back at the Hill. So Governor Kate Brown, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride. My next guest is Casey Suffredini, I just mentioned, CEO and National Campaign Director of Freedom for All Americans, a campaign bringing together Republicans, Democrats, businesses, people of faith, and more, all working to secure full non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people nationwide. Casey, I don't know how you do what you're doing, but you are committed. I'll just put it in my terms, odd bedfellow relationships, right? Or odd bed person relationships. And in that, you know, I'm interested in the magic of it and how it's going when it comes to, you know, I talk to folks a lot on both sides of the aisle, and you know, they often are talking about things that are so important to Americans, but they, you know, gravity works a little bit different depending on where they sit. But tell our audience a little bit about what you're doing and some of the groups you're bringing together, who we've kind of, unfortunately, in this toxic time, we don't usually see together.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. You know, so Freedom for All Americans is the national campaign to secure nationwide non-discrimination protections. And a core strategy, as you were saying, that we are employing is actually bringing together these strange bedfellows, bringing together progressives as well as conservatives, business as well as labor, elected officials as well as faith leaders, all to really demonstrate that, you know, America is ready for Congress to take action, pass a federal law, and ensure that all LGBTQ people are protected from discrimination in all aspects of life and treated with dignity and respect. You know, we live in a moment right now where there are 29 states in this country where LGBTQ people lack express non-discrimination protections. And this year, we actually have a historic opportunity to fix that by passing a federal law. The bill is called the Equality Act. You know, the public is fully behind these protections. As of 2021, we've got 83% of Americans nationwide who support these protections, 68% of Republicans, 77% of Catholics, 62% of evangelicals. You know, people are often surprised to hear that we don't have these protections. They're often surprised to hear how much public support there is, but it's there. The public support is fully there, and we think that this is the year that Congress really needs to come together and get it done.
So, well, the House, of course, did, and the Senate has not moved forward. You have, as part of the Freedom for All Americans activities, you have a group called Conservatives Against Discrimination Coalition. You know, can you unleash them to some folks in the Senate and see if they might move the Equality Act?
Oh, for sure. And we actually don't need to unleash them because they are fully energized all on their own. You know, their perspective. So this is a coalition that is led by former Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, you know, Republican, and former Secretary of State in Kentucky, Trey Grayson. And what they've been working on over the last several years is to bring together current and former conservative lawmakers, as well as conservative thought leaders like Anna Navarro, et cetera, to come together and actually talk with their peers about the fact that, you know, this is a conservative issue, right? Freedom and individual opportunity, these are conservative values. They don't need to reach into somebody else's values in order to support this and in order to get this done. And they've done great work. You know, at the end of the day, I think senators on both sides of the aisle, what they care most about is getting reelected, right? Delivering for their constituents what their constituents want. And so, you know, this coalition and these leaders have been speaking peer to peer, trying to organize folks to, you know, demonstrate that this support is there. But we also have, over the last couple of years, and particularly in the last 6 months, you know, hundreds and thousands of constituents all across the country who are calling their senators, going in and doing meetings with their senators. I know you were just talking with the governor about the business support. Businesses are doing these meetings as well, really conveying this point, you know, that I was saying before about the fact that America is ready. This is what your constituents want. There's no risk in taking this vote. In fact, you will be rewarded when you do it.
What do you think it would require? I'm just sort of thinking one issue that, you know, I think it is a truth that if you look at many of the political advocacy groups in the LGBTQ arena. We were just talking about the Victory Fund. I would say there are very few times that Republican political leaders have been held up and celebrated and awarded. Someone like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and she may have. Just so I don't get a bunch of hate mail, I have great respect for former Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen, but the orientation, the political orientation, has been very much on the Democratic and the progressive side of the equation. But as you pointing out, there are people who are standing up and taking leadership. Do some of these institutions need to be introspective, take a look, because it might be valuable, in fact, if they held up and celebrated and put out in a hand, gave an award or something in favor of some people on the other side of the political aisle that maybe would detox the approach on some of this?
Well, there are examples. You're correct that they're not as common as examples of standing up in support of Democrats, but there are examples of a number of different movement organizations who have come forward and endorsed Republicans in particular races and things. But I think we're living in a moment where I know you were talking with Senator McBride, and she was talking about how formal legal equality, the passage of the Equality Act, this is not going to end issues for LGBTQ people. It's really the beginning of addressing these issues. And what we really need is transformative cultural change, right? We need institutions and elected leaders, faith leaders, et cetera, to change how they think about LGBTQ people and change, therefore, by that nature, what our interactions with them are like. I think these conversations about formal equality are how we get to that transformative change, right? So we have not passed the equality yet, but in the process of building support for it, we have won over 400 corporations, over 50 national trade associations who support these protections. And in those institutions, LGBTQ people are having better experiences as a result. I think we have to keep in mind that when we were working to secure marriage equality, we didn't really have the support of many lawmakers at all, right? So we have a lot of Democratic support now that we didn't have as a community before. But to get to that transformative change that we want, as a stop along the way, getting the legal change that we want, we do have to be working, across the aisle and working to move people to support our positions, right, to see that popular opinion supports us and supports them evolving in their positions. And we'll continue to do that work. And I think as Republicans do evolve, they will get those endorsements. They will get the support of the community. But they've got to come out and say that they support the things that we say matter most to our population.
Casey, just real quick, because I know you have to go, faith groups. You're making a lot of progress with faith groups. We had Representative Richie Torres on later who said, from his viewpoint, the culture wars are raging. A lot of Republicans are doubling down. They see the divide. How are you making progress with faith groups?
Well, faith groups are ordinary people who are living in their communities, right? At the end of the day, we talk a lot about the politics and the policy here, but at the end of the day, this issue is actually about something really simple. It's about dignity and respect. It's about treating our neighbors the way we want to be treated. It's about the golden rule. And there are no communities in this country where the golden rule resonates more than with people of faith. That's right. What faith is all about. It's about treating each other with dignity and respect. And so that is how we're entering those conversations. I mentioned some of the statistics. The support in faith communities is very high at this point. 77% of Catholics, 62% of evangelicals, places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. I think it's important, as these wars rage, for people to remember that, LGBTQ people are also people of faith. They worship alongside non-LGBTQ people in these faith communities. And a lot of people of faith who support LGBTQ people do so because they know us and they love us, and also because their faith calls them to. They often speak publicly about the fact that they're not supporting us in spite of their faith, but because their faith tells them that this is the right thing to do. So, this is about people. This is not about politics, and it's these one-on-one conversations and people getting to know us that's actually moving all the folks that are supporting us, including people of faith.
Casey Seferdini, I just think you're doing fantastic work. I want to have you back someday, kind of get a status report on these odd bed person relationships and what you're getting with them. Casey Seferdini, CEO and National Campaign Director of Freedom for All Americans. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
My next guest is Todd Sears, founder and CEO of Out Leadership, a global business network that strives to make LGBT equality a priority in C-suites, business leadership, so that CEOs in multinational companies understand the positive business impacts of inclusion. Todd, let me just ask you, and great to have you on and talking this long line of, my mind's being stretched out in all different places. I guess the question, I always ask this, can we put this topic out of business sometime because we accomplished everything, it's easy to do it. So I guess my question to you, is it an easy lift or a tough lift to do what you're doing right now in terms of convincing firms that they benefit through inclusion?
Well, I would say 10 years ago when I started Out Leadership, it was a much harder lift than it is now. 10 years ago, it was actually a risk for CEOs and businesses to speak up about LGBT equality. Our summits actually were the first time that had ever happened. And now 10 years later, we have 85 multinational companies, over 700 CEOs that are working with us all over the world. And I think the risk is actually not speaking up now, where 10 years ago, it was a risk to speak up. Now companies look like they're out of step if they're not speaking out in the places where they do business. We've been able to convene them all over the world. Casey is actually one of our great partners in Freedom for All Americans, but not just the United States. In 67 countries around the world, LGBTQ people are still illegal, criminalized, and in a lot of places killed and put in jail. But in all of those places, we do business. So my framework is if I can have our companies, and we do have our companies use the economic platform they have in those countries and in those places, we can make change.
Todd, there were, when we were still flying around, and, I was one of the attendees, I admit I would go to the World Economic Forum in Davos, I would meet, fascinating business leaders. But at least up until a couple of years ago, and I don't know, if you went in and you were going to meet the nations and the world's leading figures in LGBTQ rights, they would meet outside the Congress Pavilion. They would meet at Microsoft's Pavilion with Brad Smith and said, we're doing this here to send a signal to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum that this ought not to be on the fringe, this ought to be central. I think Facebook tried to do the same thing. Google and other places tried to do the same thing. But my sense is that impact hasn't been made at one of the world's largest convenings of business leaders in the world. So can you either update me and tell me where I'm wrong, or is that on your agenda to try to continue to enlighten, I should say, some of those at the World Economic Forum?
Well, you're almost right. There was one convening that was on the main stage. Our leadership helped convene it with Microsoft, EY. Beth Brooke actually was one of the main speakers there. Everything else, as you mentioned, has been on the side stages. But I think what's interesting and my approach is actually Out Leadership has convened our own summits. So we have summits in New York, London, Hong Kong, Paris, Sydney. We're launching in South America. Every one of those summits is hosted by a CEO, attended by CEOs and senior business leaders in those regions. And I would argue that makes a whole lot more impact than a Davos. We've been able to get folks to have the conversations at World Economic Forum. But when the CEO of HSBC hosts an LGBTQ business summit in Hong Kong and turns his building into a giant rainbow in the Hong Kong skyline and sends a message, and then, by the way, he's the chair of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the next day he's in Singapore where gay people are still criminalized. And he's able to make the case in those closed door meetings that it's actually bad for business for Singapore not to be supportive of LGBTQ people. To me, that's a whole lot more important than just getting folks talking at Davos.
That's a great point. And Beth Brooke is a friend. And Beth, when she was, for our audience, was previously vice chair of EY. And when she was there, she commissioned a set of studies once that looked at gender inclusion on boards of directors. And they were able to show the economic bottom line that those companies across the board that had gender inclusion built into their board of directors and their governance and leadership did better than those that didn't, so that those that were walking the walk of it did it. I'm interested in whether or not there are studies that kind of look at LGBTQ inclusion in the same light in terms of looking at those companies that are, I won't call flat earth, but non-inclusive versus those that are. Is there evidence out there that you folks have been able to share?
Absolutely. So one of the initiatives of Out Leadership is called Quorum. I started almost 8 years ago, and it's the first LGBTQ board leadership program. And we've got kind of 3 key pillars. So research is one of them, and we published the first ever LGBTQ board research called Visibility Counts, the LGBTQ board opportunity, just this last February. But what we've also been able to do is create the demand side of the equation. When I started Quorum, there were only 2 companies in the entire Fortune 500 that include LGBTQ leaders in the definition of board diversity, which has actually resulted in, by our unscientific count, 27 out board members in the entire Fortune 500, which is about 0.4%. So what we've been able to do is not just create the data, as you mentioned, just like Beth, and Beth actually is on Out Leadership's board. We're very lucky to have her, but not just the data, but also the demand. So we've been able to get pension funds, for example, like New York City, New York State, CalPERS, and CalSTRS, the 4 largest in the country, to amend their diversity mandates to be LGBTQ inclusive, which is about $4 trillion of assets that say that LGBTQ leaders matter when companies are being invested in. And then the final thing is that we've been able to work with companies like Goldman Sachs, for example, where at Davos, David Solomon announced that they would no longer take a company public if they didn't have at least 2 diverse board members. And for Goldman, diversity includes LGBTQ leaders. Or the NASDAQ's proposal to the SEC actually quoted our research 7 times, making the case that the NASDAQ should have LGBTQ inclusive board diversity for all 3,000 NASDAQ listed companies. So more and more companies, Egon Zehnder is the first search firm in the world to support this effort. None of the other search firms are focusing on LGBT equality or inclusion at the board level, which is something we're trying to change. So there's a huge momentum and groundswell, I would say, the last 2 years. But the first 5 years, it was sort of like shouting into the wind. No one was focusing on it.
So I know you're succeeding in this, Todd, because I had a conversation the other day with the CEO of PwC North America, Tim Ryan. And PwC is making all sorts of commitments on the inclusion agenda, the purpose agenda, ESG, looking across the board, and so much of it, and changing the parameters for the lifetime health support for those that go through transgender, gender affirming surgeries and related health issues. And sort of expanding that. So you kind of look across the board, the next 5 years of PwC are going to be very, very interesting, because not only inside their company that they're doing this, they're trying, of course, to push purpose and this scaffolding, if you will, and this DNA into their client company. So I know you're succeeding. So let's just sort of take them off, all the good folks off the board. Tell us who's not good. I mean, I sometimes believe in sometimes, the top 10 good firms and the worst 10. Sometimes that can be very compelling. But as you look at the map of what you're trying to achieve now, where or who, what can you tell me about the places that are not coming along?
Well, actually, since you mentioned MAP, I'll talk about our Out Leadership LGBTQ Business Climate Index. We launched it 3 years ago. Actually, Freedom for All Americans, Movement Advancement Project, the Williams Institute, so many nonprofits have been partners with us on it. And what we sought to do was actually illustrate exactly where these state-by-state challenges still exist. Because marriage equality, as actually Casey was just saying, marriage equality did not solve all of the problems for the LGBTQ community. Not everybody wants to get married, but everybody does want to have fair employment and have an opportunity for housing and not be discriminated against because they have HIV. And all of those things are still a reality for so many millions of LGBTQ Americans all over the country. So we created this index to rank all 50 US states on 20 publicly identifiable data points. And then we built CEO business briefs for them, just like we have for 29 countries outside the US. So the business leaders in those states can actually understand how they can advocate for change, whether it's in Tennessee, which has passed 11 anti-trans bills in the last 12 months, or Florida, or Texas, or Montana, or Wisconsin, you name it. The opportunity for businesses to advocate as a business opportunity and imperative. And you're exactly right. We found that this year, the top 25 states increased and the bottom 25 states decreased. So the polarization that we're seeing as a nation is absolutely playing out as it relates to LGBTQ policies. And as it relates to these companies are in the same way. There are so many companies that are pushing the agenda forward, and equally there are companies that are being a bit stagnant. And the final thing I'll say about it is that we have noticed that we actually have data that shows that from a state perspective and a company perspective, LGBTQ people are voting with their feet. Almost 40% of LGBTQ leaders from our research last year said that they would leave an anti-LGBTQ state for a more friendly state, and they're willing to give up 25% of their compensation to do so. So from an opportunity perspective, these businesses are finally waking up and making that policy part of their business reality.
Well, Todd, I'm also a fan of your tweets and Out Leadership, and you sent out something. A friend of mine, Fabrice Hudard, we both know the immense pool of LGBTQ plus board-ready talent is often untapped because it exists at the periphery of the board ecosystem, including in informal networks. One of Fabrice Hudard's articles on this, he's also done an enormous amount of stuff on this front to help. Well, Todd, it's a real pleasure. I hope you'll come back, give a status report, talk to us. This is not kind of, I believe in Pride Month, so happy Pride, but actually I think we ought to be talking about this every month. So come back and let's keep us informed on it. Thank you very much, Todd Sears, founder and CEO of Out Leadership. Congrats on all you are accomplishing.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this important work. The visibility matters a great deal. I look forward to more.
The Supreme Court declared marriage equality the law of the land in its landmark 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges ruling, but the road to that decision was decades in the making. Here to discuss that journey, I'm joined by Kristen Maxwell Cooper, Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of The Knot. And The Knot is really cool. I did not know about The Knot, but I'm now really into The Knot, whose summer 2021 issue features the magazine's first gay couple on its cover. And Sasha Eisenberg, great friend, author of the newly released book, and gotta tell you, it's the book. It is the tome on same-sex marriage. The released book called The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage. Kristen and Sasha, it's great to be with you. What our graphic on The Engagement doesn't quite get is it's about this thick. Everything. So Sasha, great to see you. But let me just open up for a minute, Kristen. You are excuse me if I get the language wrong. I think you're degenderizing marriage. Is that right?
Yes, obviously weddings and marriage are very rooted in gender and in tradition. And so we are, the magazine, I think, is a really great example of what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to make all couples visible and not make assumptions about couples, not make assumptions about their love, about their story, about their wedding, about their marriage. And we, whether that's through terminology that we're using, so instead of things like bridal shower, make it a wedding shower, those types of things. But and then also just in all of our touch points across our brand, making sure that all couples feel that we are there for them.
I mean, before I jump to Sasha for a minute, because what Sasha outlines in his book is how the debate over same-sex marriage became transformative for the nation in terms of its, I don't know the terms of its capacity. It changed society. And in a way, The Knot and what you're doing is somehow a manifestation of these trends that I think. But there's another side to it. My family's from Bartlesville, Oklahoma, right? It's not, there are a lot of progressives in Bartlesville, but there are a lot of non-progressives in Bartlesville. And most of them where Sasha did, they accept same-sex marriage. But they like bridal showers. Is there a way to degenderize and still let people be where they're at? In other words, can we coexist with frameworks and terminologies that show different pathways on marriage, which you're in this business, or do we all need to move to a one-size-fits-all?
When we look at our content, when we look at things that we are writing for couples, what we're trying to do is not segment out our content, not write for LGBTQ plus couples for ideas and inspiration, and then ideas and inspiration for heterosexual couples. What we're trying to do is a wedding is a wedding, and we're encouraging all of our couples to just personalize their wedding, whether they want to break, twist, create new traditions, whatever it is, but based on their personalities and their interests. Like I said before, we just don't want to make any assumptions. So if you want to have a bridal shower and you want to call it a bridal shower, that's your prerogative for sure. But we also just want to make sure that everyone feels like that there are ideas and inspiration for them, however they want to get married.
Thank you for that. Sasha, your book is a masterpiece.
Thank you, Steve.
I should tell the audience, it was very emotional for me because I lived through much of this. I am married to a man. You've kind of gone through and you kind of captured so much of this, but just the detail, the richness of your writing, I tell everyone to do this. But as you kind of go through the story of the transformation, and I believe in uncomfortable conversations, I believe in odd bed person relationships. It's the only way things move along, and you deal with that. And I'm just interested in as you tell this story, which by the way, the New York Times editors picked as their editor's choice to tell people to read. What do you want your reader to most understand about the transformation of this country and why this battle was so important?
I think that no part of this was inevitable. You started by mentioning the Obergefell decision in 2015, and I think there's a natural instinct for us when something ends at the Supreme Court and we see, a new set of rights extended to, or old rights extended to new people. Because the outcome is just, we sort of assume that the getting there was inevitable. And what comes through in the story I tell is that no part of this was inevitable. It was not inevitable that this was going to be the defining gay rights demand of of the last generation. It certainly wasn't inevitable that it was going to get to the Supreme Court when it did and have the outcome that it did. And it certainly wasn't inevitable that you were going to get, what we just saw in Gallup surveys, 70% of the population now accepting this. And that was the result of decisions by individuals, institutions about tactics and strategy and timing. Some of them had their intended consequences. Some of them backfired. But, the sort of choice of what we fight over as a society and where we end up as a result of those conflicts is something that does not come from fate or history. I mean, it's shaped by the actions of people. And part of what I show is we, as a country, sort of stumbled into this debate over marriage. Nobody was asking for marriage equality as a demand in the gay rights movement, and but he was trying to stop gay people from getting married in the 1980s. And so we as a country have had to sort of adjust to the fact that this issue came on our plate. And, and I think a lot of what you see from Kristen's work is that, marriage is stronger as a result of us as a country having had to wrestle with what marriage means and who it should be available to.
Sasha, are there people who stand out as being vital to the story? I remember very intense debates inside the LGBT community, but particularly between in the lesbian gay community, on whether or not we should go for civil unions or go for marriage. It was I have to tell you, I had friends on all sides of this, but they were bitter, very deep fights on these issues. I remember very clearly the Sunday morning when Joe Biden kind of kicked open the door from a political perspective. That issue, and I'll tell the public because I know about it personally because I wrote about it, that issue of Joe Biden stepping in front of President Obama, it came as close to Joe Biden being kicked off the next ticket as any other thing Joe Biden had done. It had that sensitivity of him stepping forward on this. So I'm just interested in who some of the characters were that you sort of see as vital to the story, both positive and negative.
Yeah, I mean, so, the book starts with a guy named Bill Woods, who was the gay rights activist in Honolulu in 1970s, 1980s. And he gets into a very petty rivalry for control of a Pride Planning Committee in 1989. And basically it spirals out of control. And in December 1990, he leads 3 couples into the Honolulu office of the Hawaii Department of Public Health. He's not a lawyer. He's misread the state's marriage law. He thinks that possibly these couples could get married legally. They don't. They get rejected, and they get handed to a local civil rights attorney, a guy named Dan Foley, who had done some work on gay rights issues, but was not a sort of part of the LGBT legal establishment by any means. And he launches a long shot lawsuit against Hawaii's law in 1991. And to the surprise of everybody, the Hawaii Supreme Court rules for the first court anywhere on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples in the spring of 1993. And that's the world we're living in now. The Defense of Marriage Act was sort of Congress's effort to insulate the rest of the country from this Hawaii being very, basically on the cusp of marrying gay couples. And so this issue sort of gets pushed into our politics by a combination of a local activist who does it almost by accident, by 3 couples who sort of take a gander on being part of this PR stunt, not knowing what they're getting into, a lawyer who files this constitutional challenge in the state. And we see all sorts of versions of that play out where people don't really know what they're doing. And the civil unions debate happened because Vermont Supreme Court basically came up with a version of a compromise ruling, and the Vermont legislature created this new institution out of nowhere, and all of a sudden politicians were being forced to deal with it. This is really a story of politicians being followers of public opinion rather than leaders, I think, and often an issue being sort of forced onto this is not an issue that started in Washington. This didn't start in any institutional building in any state capital. This was something that sort of got pushed onto the center of American politics from the periphery.
Chris, and there's a quote that Oprah Daly grabbed from the engagement. It says, "In less than 30 years, gay marriage went from being a test of the moral and political imagination to settled policy in 50 states and a simple, even banal fact of everyday life." Now, I know that marriages are not a banal fact of everyday life, but when you had the 2 men on the cover of The Knot, what did you get pushback? Was there? I mean, if you were to kind of rank applause versus those that just said, "What are you doing?" What was the temperature after this piece?
Sure. So, this is actually one of our most visible, obviously, examples of us being accepting and us being inclusive. But this is something we do on our Instagram every single day. This is something that we do on many touch points throughout our platforms. So I think that people expected this from us. And this is something that has been, we've wanted to do for a long time. It is something that we want to continue doing. We don't want to just be the first. We don't want to just, have this PRable moment. We want this to become the norm, which is why we're doing this, which is why we're giving couples such visibility, because we want to just make all types of love just something that is, that is everyone can celebrate.
I'll just tell our audience that, in the Twitter of @TheKnot, beautiful weddings that Kelsey and Kirby had, and Justin and Mickey, which, highlight exactly what you're talking about and kind of coming at this. Let me just ask you just both, as we kind of get into this, we're at a moment where if you kind of look at the trends in this country, the part of the LGBTQ community that has not found itself into broad social acceptance is the transgender community. There are real challenges, violence. If you look at any major city, it's horrific when you look at some of the violence our transgender brothers and sisters have felt as a result of first responders when they too were in crisis, the deaths and violence. I mean, it's just horrific. And I'm wondering if you have insights, I'll ask you first, Kristen, into what we might do to make sure that their story, as I was discussing with Leslie and Norman earlier, is one that everyone understands is also a vital part, a normal part of our inclusive society and community.
I think it's about telling those stories. I think it's, I think that as the Knot, we have a responsibility to be telling those stories, in telling the stories of all LGBTQ plus couples. And, it's a responsibility we take very seriously and something that we talk about often. And agree with you that oftentimes transgender people do get sort of forgotten. And it's something that the Knot definitely wants to change.
Well, thank you. Sasha, let me ask you, I know that your story is one where what was achieved in same-sex marriage might not have been achieved, but given your insights of how it was achieved and what accidents and serendipity and actions by leaders had to come in, what counsel would you give those people who are worried right now about the civil rights battles that transgender people are experiencing today?
Well, one of the stories that sort of I tell in the book is how there were all sorts of divisions within the gay and lesbian community over marriage, whether it was even worth fighting for. And one of the things that unified them was the opposition. Gay rights opponents latched onto marriage as their top issue, religious conservatives, before the gay rights movement was unified. And I think we're seeing something sort of similar within around transgender politics, which is that, our parties are polarized, as you talked about in the last segment. And one thing that's happened is that the sort of Democratic Party and the LGBT movement, as part of it, have rallied around trans equality in a much more direct and quick way than they did around some gay rights issues like marriage. And I think that ultimately will be some help to the movement. The other big thing that you see in the history of marriage is that the best predictor of whether somebody not just supported marriage but was sort of liberal on any number of gay rights issues was how they answered the polling question: do you know somebody who's openly gay or lesbian? Do you have a friend, family, or coworker? And the numbers around homosexuality in the early '80s, the numbers around transgender, do you know somebody now, are somewhere around where they were around in homosexuality in the early '80s. And acceptance and political agreement sort of track that. And one thing that we see around political campaigns is they started working on ways within the sort of confines of campaigns to mimic the persuasive power of somebody knowing somebody in their real life who's gay or lesbian. And I think one thing that, people who are working on transgender related campaigns or efforts to move public opinion will be trying to do, similar to what Kristen's talking about in media, will be how do you go to people who might not have a friend or family member or coworker who's trans, but can you create in the sort of artificial setting of a campaign some sense of familiarity so that they identify with what that person is going through.
Well, terrific. Wonderful conversation. I really want to have you both back. Kristen Maxwell Cooper is the Vice President, Editor-in-Chief of The Knot. I should say The Knot is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. And inclusivity and diversity is The Knot's #1 priority. And so go check out The Knot. But then all you got to go buy the engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. It's an absolute masterpiece on this subject. Sasha Eisenberg, thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Among LGBTQ youth, the Trevor Project reports as many as 40% have considered suicide within the past 2 years. LGBT kids and teens also comprise up to 40% of all homeless youth. Here to discuss this is an amazing person. Discuss LGBTQ plus services is Ruby Corrado, real legend icon in this establishment, founder and executive director of Casa Ruby, a bilingual multicultural social services organization in Washington, D.C. Ruby, it is great to see you again. It has been a few years since I interviewed you and had discussion about this, but it is lovely to see you. I would love it if you might give our viewers and audience a deeper dive into the realities of young people who do not feel accepted, who feel stress, who are on the edge, and what we need to know to help them.
The reality is that our movement is still reshaping the way that it portrays LGBTQ people in mainstream society. And I want to focus on the positive. I think the fact that we do have young people today coming out, sometimes as early as 6 years old, which is one of the cases that we deal with at Casa Ruby, shows that things are working and people feel comfortable being visible. People feel that they also can be proud of being themselves. And what we need to do is that as many people continue to live in their truth, continue to really come out and want to really live fruitful lives being themselves, we need to work on the system in which they navigate every day after they come out.
One of the things that I just read there is the level of violence against transgendered people is at an all-time high. The Trevor Project has done studies of not just young LGBT youth, but if you're non-binary or trans, those who have ideated and thought about suicide is near 50% in a year. It's extraordinary. As you interact with elected leaders, city, county, state, federal, do they get it? Do you find the literacy of our officials where it needs to be helpful? Or do you find them illiterate and ignorant and unwilling to learn? What's the bridge there in terms of government?
I really thought that something like this will be coming into the conversation, and I will tell you that I believe they do. But I am a true believer that it is not people, that it is a system in which we navigate vulnerability in this country. And many times the system is so broken that it really does not allow for real change in the communities. And one of the things that I remember is our mayor, Mayor Bowser, a great supporter of the trans community, a great supporter of the LGBTQ community. And when she came into her office, she had all these great intentions of truly creating change in the lives of trans and queer Washingtonians. But the system has been so rigid that when it really is time for change in not only the policies, but implementing change, things get stuck. And I think that part of where we need to really look at is how do we really come from a space of looking at issues faced by trans people, by queer people, just as issues of violence. For example, there were many times people talk about violence, but they knew that it was happening in higher rates among queer communities of color, but they failed to acknowledge that that was happening. When it comes to unemployment, there was a time when about 5 to 10 years ago, I started talking about economic justice, because I believe that one of the pathways to get out of poverty or homelessness is to be able to have access to a job. And we filled an application for a transgender employment program 10 years ago. And one of the founders says, well, Ruby, we love the work that we do, but we really do not feel that we can actually fund a program because that is targeted to the transgender community, because as a foundation, we focus on the issue of unemployment. And I said, well, thank you for your feedback. And I respect, this information that you've given me, but let's really look about the issue of unemployment. If you really looked at the issue deeper, you will realize that the highest rates of unemployed people in Washington, D.C. come from the transgender community. So when we look at these issues and we look at the deep roots of what is causing these high numbers, then what you do is implement change. And how can you implement change? And that is by allowing initiatives, by allowing the people that are most affected by these issues to bring on their leadership and be part of that change. And I think that is why many times we have cities all over this country where there's this great intention, but the system gets in the way of creating that change that we need.
You know, Ruby, I think it was about 10 years ago when we had a conversation with Nora Pouillon. I'll tell our audience, Nora Pouillon was a great restaurateur, owned Nora's restaurant, loved your work, and we were chatting, and I just, was so taken with Casa Ruby and the services you were providing people, and I wanted everyone in the country to copy what you're doing, say what, and I asked you, I said, what's going on elsewhere in the United States? And you said it was pretty bleak. Has it changed in the last 10 years? Do you find the support services for young, you were an immigrant from El Salvador. You came in from San Salvador and you were appalled, but there was just nothing to help, no services. And this has been your mission to provide that. But you find places looking at the example, you now have over 50 employees, as I understand it, working, and you have a lot of folks that support you. But is that happening elsewhere in the country?
There is change, and I'm very proud to say that I took part in a program that was funded by a corporation, that it was a Transgender Institute for Leadership. And part of what the funder wanted was to replicate the story of Casa Ruby, which is very unique, which is not just the story of Ruby Corrado, but a movement of people that really got fed up living on the streets, being homeless, being hungry, and really came together to create that change that I talked about earlier. And yes, part of that program focused on 10 cities across the United States. And I am very proud that 12 cities have taken part into this project. And when you go, for example, to Houston, Texas, one of my favorite cities, you have Casa Andrea, which is one of the girls that I mentored many years ago that opened her own refuge. We have Baltimore Safe Haven, a girl that actually will come to Washington, D.C., trying to see how she could change life for Black trans women in Baltimore. And she came and was able to learn and understand Maya in Richmond, Virginia, where she actually kept seeing people coming from the Norfolk area to Washington, D.C. And she said, I want to do something. So I am able to see change. I am able to see, positive initiatives that are coming out from grassroots. Casa Ruby is a grassroots organization that where the decisions get made into the community. The community actually tells me, Ruby, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we want to see in the community. And I'm very thankful because although we still have issues that we have to tackle, I feel that right now, the community or the front lines are being prepared by people who know what the issues are, who live it every day, and they are actually adjusting to the times. We have new terms now. For example, before it used to be I used to be thinking about my pronouns and just being, I am a trans Latina. And now we have people who said, no, we are Latinx and we want to include everyone. And I think that's part of change. And I'm so excited to see that happening.
I love to hear
now.
the negotiation of identity and all this is really cool. Hey, let me ask you just real quick. I was at a Pride event last night in town, and Dr. Rachel Levine was there. I don't know if you've met Rachel, but she is now the Assistant Secretary of Health in the Department of Health and Human Services, most senior transgender official in the Biden administration, former Secretary of Health in the state of Pennsylvania, and she's cool. But I have to tell you, I saw some of the most vile reactions on Twitter, on various places, to her leadership, and she's a political figure. You're, in my book, a political figure too. But do you have any interest in sort of taking it to a different track and helping to continue your advocacy and your important work, but kind of get in and dent the political world? Uh-oh.
Yes, I am a true believer that change comes
she's back.
from
Okay, great.
within.
Please
And
go ahead.
I want, yes.
We just missed the beginning, so if you were just declaring your political track, please do it again.
I am a true believer that change comes from within. And 30 plus years ago, I made a change in my life that built me into the woman that I am today. And I recognize that waking up every day in a system that is broken, there are many ways. I gave 30 years of my life to the movement, to the LGBTQ movement right here in Washington, D.C. I announced that next year I will allow a new face, a new person to take charge of Casa Ruby and take this organization to different levels that I can only dream of. And I really believe that my next path is going to be driven by what the community wants. Many people want me to come with different initiatives. I am working on privately funded businesses that can support social justice. That is one of the things that I am working on. And the other one is politics. Yes, people very often tell me, Ruby, you will be a great advocate. I think that the people at the council need to hear your voice. I think, and many people say that you will hold them accountable, but I really think that what I want to do is I want to work together so they can see a trans woman who tried her best, who did and played by the rules, did everything that was asked of her, and has been able to build something that still needs to be supported. So eventually we all can celebrate pride, knowing that we all celebrate the equality that was dreamed of 51 years ago during the Stonewall riots.
Well, Ruby Corrado, it's been way, way too long. I really love your work. It's great to see you. I hope you'll come back. I hope we can see each other in real life, live room here before long. Ruby Corrado, founder and executive director of Casa Ruby. Congratulations on all you're doing. Thank you for helping the many young people you are. It's so important. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Some of the most controversial anti-LGBT bills considered by state legislatures this year have involved preventing transgender youth from accessing gender-confirming medical care. Here to discuss the most pressing concerns in LGBT healthcare are Cecilia Chung, Senior Director. I got to tell you, Cecilia's another hero. Cecilia Chung, Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives and Evaluation at the Transgender Law Center and former member of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, and Dr. Jesse Ehrenfeld, immediate past board chair of the American Medical Association. It's really great to see you both. And Cecilia, you just heard, I hope, some of my conversation with Ruby, but you've been working for a long time, and you've just experienced such violence. You've been, kind of in the trans community, kind of destigmatized so much. I wish you would share with our audience a little bit of what is, the name of our conversation today is America's Unfinished Business. When it comes to civil rights, when it comes to dignity, when it comes, as you see the roster, I'll ask Jesse the same thing, but give us what you see as the unfinished business that we have to have high on our minds.
That's a very interesting question because I think that while we're going to talk about healthcare, the unfinished business is really about not using the laws, to restrict who we can be and who we want to love. And I think that right now, especially when we're seeing so many anti-LGBT bills being introduced, in more conservative part of the country, we really need to ask, do they really want to provide good healthcare to people, or do they want to foster mistrust amongst, the communities and the medical providers? And I am afraid to say that right now, there's not a whole lot of trust building, when we're trying to tell parents that they can be charged with child abuse if they are supporting their trans and gender non-binary son or daughters or children to seek healthcare to support them. So I think that that's a lot of conversations we need to have.
And just real quick, another. I mean, you founded a group that I didn't know about called Positively Trans, and it was a way. And earlier we were talking about belonging and how important belonging is, and finding or books and stories that are out there, and finding ourselves in those books and stories. Tell us real quick about Positively Trans. Are you still involved with Positively Trans?
Yes, I founded Positively Trans in 2015. In fact, Ruby Corrado actually is a member of our network. And it is really about developing the leadership of transgender people, especially transgender people of color, living with HIV. And I think that the only way we can really change people's heart, not just mine, is to be able to show them who we are, our leadership, and tell our stories. And that's what we do, in addition to providing evidence-based advocacy, as well as leadership development.
Well, thank you. Dr. Ehrenfeld, I love your tweets, and I would tell everybody to go to @DrJesseMD. One of them from June 18th says, just in time for Pride 2021, my answers to youth LGBTQ questions. It's just very open, and maybe I shouldn't be surprised that's what we're talking about, but it's nice to find someone who's important at a big institution who's just so normal about this. Why can't everyone in your profession be like you?
Well, thanks for that. I'm not sure I'm that important. I think I'm pretty normal, but I am the first out officer of the American Medical Association, and it's a pleasure to serve in a leadership role and to try to help advance LGBTQ plus healthcare. Your earlier question about what's the unfinished business, and we're seeing all of these anti-transgender laws with a healthcare twist being introduced. The terrible one passed unfortunately in Arkansas earlier this year. And I just want to be very clear that gender-affirming care is medically necessary. And I come at this not just as an LGBTQ person, but as a physician. And evidence-based care that improves physical and the mental health of individuals, gender confirmation surgery, and other services ought to be provided. And the AMA, every credible medical organization strongly opposes any undue restrictions on providing evidence-based medical care. This has gotten, unfortunately, as we've talked about today, politicized in state legislatures. And really, we should not allow the intrusion of government into the practice of medicine and the criminalization of healthcare decision-making. That should just be unacceptable in America.
Do you think we're at a place where the inflection, where the tilt is? So during today's program, I got an alert that my friend Congressman Mark Takano was praising the decision by the Veterans Administration to provide expanded services for gender-affirming surgery and health care, and really saying that this was an important moment. But I have to be honest, I sort of feel like there's a little bit of whiplash, when you go back, take the issue of transgender service in the military, where Secretary Ash Carter, Eric Fanning, and others were part of that transition, and then we get a reversal. Now we're back. I'm just wondering, what do we need to do when it comes to public policy and securing it well enough so there's continuity between administrations and not this whiplash we're feeling?
Well, I think on the healthcare side, it's important that we follow the science. And unfortunately, science has been under attack and highly politicized over the past few years. And we've seen that during the pandemic, I think more than ever. And that has manifested itself in terms of some of the attacks on providing appropriate medically necessary services for LGBTQ people. The VA step is an incredibly positive one. It's a long time coming. There are thousands of transgender veterans in the VA healthcare system who for a long time have not been able to access appropriate medically indicated care that they need. That is now moving forward in a really, really positive way. And those kinds of steps, what's happened in the military has been obviously an important move forward. I served in the Navy for 10 years. I'm a combat veteran. I found myself first living under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, then being at a moment where that policy went away, but still finding this in this awkward position where, you're working with a transgender service member who still is in that cloud of they can't come out because they're going to be discharged. And so, how do you take care of the individual in front of you, follow policy? We're finally getting past some of those things. And I think there's broad consensus that, there's no there's no medical reason that somebody can't serve just because they're an LGBTQ plus person. That's been a really, really important step forward for equality. And we're starting to see the healthcare policies catch up with that within the military, the DoD, as well as the VA, as you referenced.
Thank you. Cecilia, I am fascinated by all of the strains of you. You talked a little bit to my colleagues about Asian discrimination, a little bit about HIV world, what's going on. In a little while, I'm interviewing a fascinating director, David France, who has done a number of documentaries, one on just an evil thing going on in Chechnya right now, as the leader in Chechnya is actually hunting down LGBTQ members and executing them and detaining, harassing, etc. But on another front, he said he did a show called How to Survive a Plague, which was about the early activism in HIV and how to change both the practice of science and the agenda and the responsiveness of the health community to people in need who are dying. But I guess my question to you is, as you've kind of gone through this and looked at discrimination where it is, whatever, I'd love to know from you, as we're coming out of this pandemic, do you think we learned any of the lessons from HIV? We see so many communities that did not have trust in the healthcare system, and there's been an uneven hit of the pandemic on different communities in America. When I was reading the notes from my colleagues, it just said, wow, we're seeing this replay again. Is that how you feel?
Absolutely. I think that when we looked at the HIV epidemic and the first introductions of the national AIDS strategies, which wasn't really that long ago, it was under President Obama, that we introduced the first ever national HIV AIDS strategy. And we could see actually that as a watershed moment because we know how resources are being intentionally directed, toward the systems. And, and we created all these what we call medical home today, so that people will have better access, to the services that they need. That didn't happen with COVID, even though we know that it is, a sweeping pandemic that it's going to impact the entire country. But unfortunately, the previous administrations did exactly what the Republican administration did during the HIV epidemic, that they turned a blind eye and they didn't really acknowledge, what's going on. And that kind of denial is deadly. And we've seen that happening before, and we are seeing it happening again.
Thank you. Jesse, can I ask you a question similar? You are an outstanding LGBTQ member that ran America's most important medical association. I don't have any idea what percentage the LGBT community is reflected in the broad medical profession. But oftentimes I will hear from communities that are not on the upper end of sort of health outcomes. They take Baltimore, you go to different districts in Baltimore, there'll be 20 years difference in life expectancy in these two zones. And I'll go talk to them and said, we don't see people like us as doctors. We don't see Johns Hopkins reaching out to us in a way where we are. And I guess my question to you is, to what degree do you think places like AMA or the medical profession themselves in this area of lesbians and gays and transgendered and queer and bisexual, where that's reflected among your colleagues?
Well, it's changing, and it's important that two things happen. One is that we have LGBTQ plus people in medicine who are out there as strong advocates for the community and connection, and people can see themselves reflected in the healthcare workforce. That's a critical issue. We have a strategy around that. The AMA Foundation has started funding fellowships in LGBTQ health, which is a new thing, which is exciting. But also, there are hundreds of thousands of healthcare professionals and lots of physicians in this country who are not LGBTQ plus, that's fine, but they need the skills and the competencies to take care of people. One challenge that we still face is that so many people in the community are invisible in health data. There's just no data on, for COVID-19, what's the percentage of LGBTQ people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19, who's been vaccinated in the community. We just don't know the answers to these questions because, unfortunately, our data collection systems have not yet caught up with what we know is appropriate in terms of questions that we ought to be asking every patient in every encounter about their sexual orientation and gender identity. If you're not visible, you can't be counted and you become forgotten. And so, we've been calling on NIH, pharma, the research industry to really redouble their efforts to support inclusive activities around how do we collect these data, how do we make sure that there's trust so that patients are able to feel that their data is safe and used appropriate ways. And the good news is most patients are happy to answer questions about their identity, their orientation, because they understand that it leads to better care.
Can I just ask you both real quick as we close out here? You've mentioned Arkansas. And for our audience, they may not realize that the governor signed a bill that would allow providers of health care to refuse services based on, as I understand it, their perception of moral and religious grounds. And it's I hate talking about it. I mean, is there anything that can be done? Is this going to spread? Is there anything both of you would like to ask our community to do with regards to what you've already mentioned on Arkansas? Jesse and then Cecilia?
Well, I'll say two things. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's ethical, and it would be against our AMA ethical policy to discriminate in that kind of way and against most of the ethical policies of the other related healthcare organizations. So I'll start there. We are working with the relevant state societies to file amicus briefs to challenge that law. We think it has a good reason to not be upheld, and we certainly oppose any efforts to see those things propagate in other states.
Cecilia?
And I just want to tailgate on what Dr. Evenfeld said. I think that it's really important for us to challenge it, but there is another layer to it. Is like federally speaking, like we have the Obamacare under it, Section 1557 clearly stated that LGBT patients are protected. So even though Arkansas is passing, this legislations, and I think that, a lot of our colleagues in the legal communities are stepping forward to challenge that, just like what Dr. Evenfeld had said.
Well, listen, such an important discussion, so much progress and yet so much fragility and moving back and forth. Cecilia Chung, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives and Evaluation for the Transgender Law Center and a former member of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS and the creator and founder of Positively Trans. I just love the organization. I want to learn more about it. Health Commissioner, San Francisco Department of Public Health. Really appreciate you joining us. And Dr. Jesse Ehrenfeld, the immediate past board chair of the American Medical Association. Thanks to you both for joining us. Happy Pride. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this year, an openly transgender athlete will compete and complete at the Olympics for the first time. But 8 states in the United States have passed laws targeting trans athletes' inclusion in sports. We've got someone wonderful here today. Here to discuss the impact of these laws is 2-time Masters track cycling world champion, Dr. Veronica Ivy, who is herself a transgender athlete and activist. Dr. Ivy, it's great to see you. We've had a whole slew of discussions today on as many of the dimensions of the civil rights status of LGBTQ people in this country. And every year I do this. This is about, the 6th or 7th time we've had an annual summit looking at these rights. I sort of feel like, as I mentioned ago, that there's a bit of whiplash sometimes. We've made, progress on transgender service in the military, transgender rights in various other ways, and then we see it kind of ripped back. And I always thought it would be hard to take rights back. Now I have been convinced that it's not. Can you give us, now what's exploded is the question of transgendered athletes competing in sports and states taking actions to try to stop our transgendered brothers and sisters from doing this. So I would ask you to give our audience an understanding of the state of play right now and what should they most be concerned about.
Yeah, so you're asking me how do we get here? And there is currently an all-out culture war against specifically trans people and more specifically trans feminine people. And largely, I think we got here because they failed on their bathroom bill efforts, failing to ban trans women specifically from women's bathrooms and change rooms, and how terribly North Carolina's HB2 went. that a lot of the same groups that were behind those culture war efforts saw the failure and then saw sport as another vehicle for the same types of efforts, but they don't actually care about women's sport at all. A lot of the people, I mean, like Donald Trump Jr. has hate tweeted about me ruining women's sport, for example, and I seriously doubt that he knew that masters women's track cycling was even a thing. So we're here just because they view it as a more likely avenue to continue their attempts to exclude trans people from society more generally. So this combines with those efforts to ban access for trans children, teens, adults for gender affirming care, and then even allowing medical practitioners to deny us care altogether. All of this is of a piece.
It's a package of discrimination, I know. But when Donald Trump Jr. attacked you, did you find anyone surprising come out of the woodwork to give you support?
No. I actually didn't know what had happened. I suddenly got a lot of hate email. And usually when that happens, that signals to me that something big-ish has happened in the alt-right world. And usually it's like a Breitbart article or something like that. And I found the tweet hilarious. I actually printed it out and put it on my office door in color. So, you know, I think in the current online, like Twitterverse, unfortunately, there are a lot of very vocally angry, and they're not that many, but people are their worst selves online. And so people are very scared often to voice their support. But certainly, like it was water off my back. I thought it was hilarious. He's an idiot.
You know, Veronica, when I looked into this, and I hope this is correct, my understanding is the NCAA supports transgender participation in sports, and the International Olympic Committee allows trans athletes since 2003 and also in 2016 that gender confirmation surgeries were not necessary to compete. I guess my question to you is, what has changed, and are those not important benchmarks that just sort of solidify this and protect this from this kind of temporary political blip, or am I missing something?
Well, no, nothing protects us from the political whims, because this is how the U.S. legal system is set up, that trans, like, gender identity is not a protected characteristic. It is in terms of, like, the Bostock Supreme Court decision that has to do with Title VII. We need it to be extended to Title IX, but it needs to be an enshrined human right to not discriminate against trans people for being trans. And the thing with sport in particular is, like you said, the International Olympic Committee, whom I have advised on their trans policies, have allowed trans people to compete since the 2004 Athens Olympics. And since then, we have had over 54,000 Olympians without a single Olympian even qualifying who is trans. This year, we're going to have at least 2. There might be 3. And the NCAA has had their policy for about 10 years now, and they've had over 1 million athletes, and there hasn't been a single Division I national champion who's trans. The only national champion who's trans was a Division II athlete, Cece Telfer, and she just won that in the last year before COVID. So if there were going to be this explosion of trans women athletes taking over, it would have already happened. So it's non-science-based scaremongering, and they continue to forget about the existence of trans men athletes. And so the policies they are producing will reproduce cases like Mac Beggs being forced to compete against girls as a trans boy in high school wrestling. And people forget that the most commercially successful trans athlete is a trans male athlete who has represented the U.S. national team twice. It's Chris Mosier. So people always forget that trans male athletes exist. They always hyper-focus on trans girls.
So I want to tell our audience that Dr. Veronica Ivy is an interdisciplinary scholar and professor publishing on these issues, advising groups, trans and intersex athletes. I mean, you're a scholar and an intellectual that has looked at science and has said this. I think it is also a reality that one of the elements of the politics of this is the fear-mongering goes into communities with people that are not studied in the science, that do not have, your grounding in providing this. So when you go into those communities and you're trying to generate an understanding of the issues of people who don't know, and they're led down a path and said, hey, these were men, now women, it's unfair, et cetera. Can you please give the scaffolding of the argument so that those that don't have it, and even those people who are watching, I'm sure many people watching today see the importance of pride, they see the importance of this, and they themselves may not know the language and the scaffolding to share with others. So if you could give us a synopsis of that, I think it would be really constructive.
Sure. So the very first thing is that the International Olympic Committee really sets the stage for most sports around the world, whether they are Olympic sports or not. They set the bar. And in their Olympic charter, they have 7 fundamental principles of Olympism. And the 4th principle begins, participation in sport is a human right. And so they really do mean that. And so they, as an institution, as an organization at the most elite level of sport, have recognized for almost 20 years now that trans athletes should compete in the gender that they are. So trans women should compete in women's sport, trans men should compete in men's sport. For them, they have relaxed their policies over years. So the 2015 policy that you referenced that went into effect for 2016 removed the genital surgery component and installed just the 12-month testosterone policy. My research it involves that even the testosterone requirement is unnecessary to ensure fairness in sport. So the misframing, I think, is more important, that people are comparing like male averages and world records to female averages and world records, and they're treating trans girls and trans women as men instead of trans women. So the data that we should be looking at is how do trans women compare to cis women, not how do men compare to women, right? And so the entire scientific debate that people who oppose trans inclusion in sport, they are leaning on just men and women. They're not making the distinction between trans and cis, which is where we should be focused. And as it turns out, we didn't study this for decades because we just assumed it to be true, but your unaltered internal levels of testosterone have no relationship to your performance. So if you add testosterone more than your body is used to, your performance tends to go up, which is why we ban that for doping. And if you drop it below what it's used to, your performance will tend to go down, which is what happens for most trans athletes when they transition from male towards female. However, there is a huge range within a sex. So a male at the world elite level can be competing with natural testosterone below the women's average against another male with 50 times as much natural testosterone with no relationship to performance. So the focus on testosterone is completely misplaced scientifically.
Well, listen, I just want to tell, I love this tweet that you said, "Newsflash, Trump Jr., I'm a woman," says transgender cyclist Dr. Veronica Ivy. I love your tweets, and I just you're saying sports is a human right. Thank you so much, Veronica Ivy, Masters Track Cycling World Champion, scholar, writer on these issues. Let me just ask you real quickly one last fast thing. Where can our audience go somewhere cool that you respect to learn more about this? VeronicaIvy.com.
I guess.
Well, go to her Twitter feed. Go to Veronica's Twitter feed. There's an enormous amount of great linked information and material that comes from all over. I think this issue is going to be with us for a while, given what's gone on in states around the country. I think it's important. I just want to be able to direct our audience to important other informed bit of opinion and research and science, as you said, on these issues. So Veronica Ivy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
My next guest, Wilson Cruz, is a pioneer of representation. In 1994, at only 20 years old, he made American television history as the first openly gay actor to play an openly gay series regular character in My So-Called Life. In the years since his groundbreaking debut, he's been an advocate for LGBT visibility in media, and he now stars in the Paramount Plus series Star Trek Discovery, where he plays one half of the first gay couple in the long-running franchise's history. Wilson, it's really an honor to meet with you. This has been a long day of talking to a lot of people. I'm a fan. My husband's a fan. But we're not doing a rah-rah day. This has been a day where we've been kind of looking at the question of yes, there's been a lot achieved in civil rights. Yes, there's representation in the media, but there's struggles going on in corners of the LGBT community that, to my mind, are pretty horrific. When you look at violence, you look at these issues, you have an important, visible role on these stories. And as you look at what you're choosing to be active about, the stories you're trying to tell, what should we share with our audience today?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm so glad I was able to listen in on that last interview because I learned so much. And I'm so grateful to Dr. Ivy for that. But also, I wanted to say that another resource besides Dr. Ivy is Sid Ziegler and Outsports. And I think it's outsports.com. Anyway.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Back to your question.
I will tell my producers real quick, they have the wrong thing. We love David France, who's coming up next. But anyway, I just want to make sure we tag you right. Wilson Cruz. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
They got it right. So what was the question now? Now I forgot.
Well, no, I want to ask, in this kind of world of unfinished business, what's unfinished business in your mind?
Well, for me, pride for me is always about looking back a little bit and seeing how far we've come and also acknowledging all the people who got us to this point. And I was listening to this podcast recently, and they were looking back at the people who started who really started the movement. And there was this African-American woman, her name is Ernestine Eckstein, and this was in before Stonewall, so early 65-ish. And you can hear her in this interview after protesting in front of the White House, talking about the fact that at 22 years old in the mid-60s, she had never seen or heard of another lesbian, let alone another lesbian of color. So when I think about Ernestine Eckstein, who didn't relate to anyone, didn't have anyone representing, didn't have anyone to point to allow her to understand her own humanity, but yet found the strength to protest and understand that people needed visibility of this community. It moves me and inspires me. So when I think about what we're doing on Star Trek Discovery, where it's not just Anthony Rapp and I, it's Anthony Rapp and I in this relationship. It's Ian Alexander and Blue Del Barrio, who play non-binary and trans characters. There's Tig Notaro, who plays a lesbian character. And we're saying that not only should you see us and appreciate us as part of this LGBTQ community, but we're saying we have always been here and we will always be here, so that there will be no more Ernestine Ecksteins who are looking for some sign of their humanity in media. We save lives when we allow our community to see themselves and have their lives reflected back at them. And part of what needs to where we need to progress is the fact that we need to see a diversity of images within the LGBTQ community, because even today, the predominant view of LGBTQ folks that we have in media is still gay white men feed, just like you. And so we want to see more people from throughout our community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, trans, who look like the community itself. And so that means seeing more Black, brown, indigenous, and immigrant stories, people searching for asylum, because around the world, people are looking to American media to see themselves and understand that they're not alone.
Look, I think what you just said is so profound. And I'll just share a personal story, because there used to be a time for people to kind of look at how this has evolved. You know, one of my best friends in college is Darren Star. Those of you may know him from Beverly Hills 90210 and Sex and the City and Melrose Place. And when Melrose Place brought on the first gay character, white gay men like me had not seen ourselves on the screen in TV. And it was a big deal. And it was at the GLAAD Media Awards. I know you're very involved as national spokesperson for GLAAD. It changed it. It changed the vector for so many people at that time. And it's just, I think, unforgivable that it's taken decades to get so many more people, you know, seeing themselves on screen from the LGBTQ community. I think it's happening, but we have to admit it took way too long for it to happen. So very, very powerful. You were the Grand Marshal of the New York City Pride Parade. How was that?
Well, it's this year. I'm the Grand Marshal, or one of the Grand Marshals this year.
Yeah.
But it's all virtual. So the virtual march takes place on Sunday.
I mean, it hasn't happened yet?
No, it's this weekend, Pride weekend.
Okay, all right. Well, it shows you how out of touch I am. Well, great. And so, what are you going to do? Give us a little, preview.
Well, there is a whole pre-recorded program. I threw in a wave or two. I wore my sash. I'll show you my sash, in case you don't. So I wore my little sash, there is a virtual march, and we did a whole bunch of pre-recorded content for that. And then there's a street festival that's taking place in the city from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. I believe. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the city. But I've been, doing the press tour and bringing attention to Pride and to New York City Pride, and that's kind of been my my job this year.
Well, it's on your Twitter. It's on your Twitter feed right up there at the top. Grand Marshal, you're very proud of it. Look, I think it's great. I mean, do you get a chance? I mean, like I always wonder when people have kind of reached a level of kind of celebrity status, how you find your grounding. I mean, I was shocked and really upset about the Trevor Project's findings that so many young LGBT youth have thought about suicide. These are horrible, toxic times, and I know that you're trying to sort of deal with that. It's a big question I'm supposed to ask. How do you ground? I mean, do you go out and ever get a chance to meet some young people in New York and others, and and give them? I don't know how to give them hope. How can you bottle and give kids hope so that they understand that the future will be better and not worse?
Well, I think part of what I do personally is sit on the board of GLSEN. I sit on the national board of GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Educators Network. And our mission is to make every school in this union a safe space for LGBTQ students. Because for me and for GLSEN, the key to an LGBTQ student fulfilling their potential starts at school. And for many of our students, home is how can I put this? A less than desirable place to be a lot of the time. And during this pandemic, there was another pandemic of young people who were at home under really dire circumstances and didn't have the outlets that they had for support, which they usually receive at school. So for me, it's really about setting up our kids to succeed. I don't want any of these kids to grow up and be 22 years old and say, I didn't understand that I'm human and that I'm perfect exactly as I am. I want them to know that now, and I want to invest in their futures.
How do you think the state of Hollywood is now? We've had a few years where questions about racism, structural racism in Hollywood, in the roles of their sexual harassment and discrimination and violence with the Harvey Weinstein issues going on. Do you feel as if characters like yours are going to become more the norm? And do you think overall in the industry it's cleaning itself up?
I think the industry is in a transitional moment. I think it's looking at itself and seeing that too many of us who come from marginalized communities are not in positions of power. we are not content creators to the level that our white counterparts are. So I think at the moment we're seeing a lot of search for talent of color and who will give us those stories that we long to see, right? I think part of the problem is that people write what they know. So if you're not hiring people who know different things, you're going to continue to see the same thing over and over. And that's kind of what we've seen on television and in film. So I think when we diversify the people who get to tell stories, who will cast them with people who look like them and tell stories that speak to their lived experiences, we're going to see a more diverse media landscape. And I think
just
that's
finally,
happening as we speak.
Yeah, finally, Wilson, I know this is going to be like a, fan club question, but, George Takei, I used to run with George Takei and Front Runners many years ago. And George is just this lovely, wonderful activist as well. He didn't play a gay character on Star Trek. I think he really wishes he could have, but I'm wondering if you've talked to him, and I wonder how jealous he is that you according to one Yahoo line, you get to play the queerest person in the history of TV. And so I'm just interested in whether you've talked to George at all about this.
We're bringing you the queerest Trek in history.
Yeah, queerest Trek. Yeah, exactly.
But I've known George Takei, for years, even before I was a part of the Trek universe, because when I was the national spokesperson at GLAAD, he was very active with us.
Right.
And he actually received our highest honor the last year that I was there. But he has been a huge support. He was actually, if not the first, one of the very first people who tweeted out their support and reached out to Anthony and I personally. He's been an incredible support to us. So I think he's living vicariously through us. And we're happy that he's doing it.
Well, George and Brad Takei are a great couple in this, and he's been fighting anti-Asian discrimination, anti-gay discrimination, anti-LGBT discrimination across the board for folks there, and I'm glad to see that you're doing the same. So Wilson Cruz, actor, producer, Grand Marshal, next week of the New York City Pride 2021. I can do that. I used to have pointy ears too. But anyway, Wilson, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for helping to anchor our great conversation on unfinished business in the LGBTQ world. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Happy Pride to everyone out there.
Joining me now is Academy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker David France, whose 2020 film, Welcome to Chechnya, chronicles a group of activists risking their lives to combat ongoing anti-LGBTQ persecution in the closed Russian Republic of Chechnya. He's also directed, written, and produced two other documentaries concerning LGBT activism, and they are How to Survive a Plague and The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. David, great to be with you. Look, you dive into these subjects that are oftentimes uncomfortable for people to hear. And Welcome to Chechnya. I mean, it's just such a shock to me that we're seeing the active, state-directed, not just harassment, but the execution of gay people with a ruler there who wants to purge the gay communities out of their blood. I mean, it sounds like Nazis to me. Tell our viewers about this, because I'm sitting here shocked saying, well, I knew stuff was going on, but honestly, I did not know the intensity.
Well, you're right to compare it to Nazi Germany, because not since then has there been a government-directed and a government-executed campaign to round up and torture and eliminate all LGBTQ citizens. And that's what's going on there. It's been going on since early 2017. The world has paid way too little attention to it. And in that void, the atrocities have continued, and it's really fallen to ordinary LGBTQ activists in Russia to do something about it themselves. And that's what the film really displays, is the extreme courage that people have taken to the task of trying to save lives by rescuing people, building an underground network of safe houses to secret people out of the country, and literally one at a time removing LGBTQ Chechens from the moral danger that they find themselves in.
David, so they've created their own underground railway. I mean, they've created their own system of escape. And so I just will ask you, without revealing which I know you take great care to protect them in the film. But can you tell us how you reported this? And also you went to extraordinary lengths, which, frankly, I've only seen in, Tom Cruise clips on TikTok, of the new application of technologies to hide and mask without, in ways that, change voice, change data. You can put any face on someone. Share with our audiences, because the technique is stunning.
Well, the diabolical nature of what's happening in Chechnya is such that it's not just enough to get away from Chechnya. They're not just trying to scare queer Chechens out of the republic. They are literally attempting to, as they describe it, to cleanse the blood of the Chechen minority line. And that means hunting people around the globe. So when I first approached people who had survived this in the shelter system with a suggestion that I make a film to try to elevate and amplify their voices in trying to tell the story about what's happening there, they were immediately concerned that if they were found to still be alive, if the film somehow exposed their ongoingness, that it would put an even bigger target on them for them to be hunted anywhere in the world. And we've seen now over the last year and a half people being discovered and abducted in Europe and in parts of Russia, and being threatened wherever they are. So my promise had to be to them that I would tell their stories faithfully while not revealing their identities. And I wanted, nonetheless, to be able to film them, to understand from their faces, from their journeys through this reckoning and survival's escape, what it was like to be them, and what the stakes are and the ramifications are and the lasting injuries are of this kind of atrocity. And so I brought the footage back to New York and began working with it to find ways to do that kind of disguise work that didn't detract from the humanity of the people who agreed to let me tell their stories. We settled on a version of visual effects that, you're right, is used sometimes in Hollywood films. Never in a documentary, never in any film to the extent that we've used it, which is in 23 characters and over 100 minutes of the film. We had to find new faces for the people who are on the run. And we did that by recruiting activists, mostly in New York, who had already joined their voices to the solidarity movement around Russia. And I asked them if they would lend their faces as an act of activism so that we could bring them into this algorithmic database and then begin the work of mapping their face over the faces of the people that we filmed. And the net result doesn't impact in any way the actions of the people that I filmed. It doesn't change anything about their expressions or micro-expressions. It literally just transfers someone else's skin over their face and appears to be somebody else telling that story. And I worked with all the people on the ground to make sure that they were comfortable, that I was doing nothing that would further endanger them. So with all the sign-offs, we were able to put this in motion and do a kind of a face transplant on a mass scale through the film.
I think it's extraordinary. Let me ask you, I'd love to get kind of you've done these troika films, but before I get there, on all of your work that is addressing bigotry, discrimination, and the real lives of people in the LGBTQ community, I want to ask you, I heard just from someone who knew that I'd be talking to you from the Holocaust Museum, so I know that this film and you are on the map of those people concerned about human rights, and particularly LGBTQ human rights. But are you on the map of the White House? When President Biden met with President Putin in Russia, was an issue of this import raised? Are you talking, have they been provoked by your film and work to actually understand and elevate to Russia the issues that the world is watching, what's happening in one of its republics?
Well, in fact, we just had a State Department screening this morning, with people who are directly involved in that work. And we learned that the White House has brought up the issue of what's happening in Chechnya to Putin directly, and so it is now part of high-level conversations. This did not exist, as you might imagine, in the previous administration, which was so chummy with Putin and his administration. Although after the film came out in June of 2020, we did a State Department screening then for the previous administration, and they issued sanctions against the Chechen leadership for the first time within 72 hours of that screening. So we did get some purchase there, but I think the film and the advocates who are taking the film around and showing it to people who are in positions of power is making a difference. It is bringing this issue to the forefront of international relations in really significant ways, as it should be. I mean, here we are now in 2021, 4 years later, and it's still happening. Just this month, Pride Month, Russian security forces, along with Chechen security forces, raided one of the safe houses that had been in operation now for some time in order to abduct one of the young women who was there, who was fleeing anti-LGBTQ dangers in Chechnya, and they kidnapped her basically and brought her back to Chechnya. Her whereabouts are unknown, her fate is unknown. Everybody in the activist community who had tried to protect her are warning that she's in mortal danger, and that's happening still, despite our new administration's willingness to elevate the issue of the crimes against humanity there.
David, I also just want to quickly, just lastly, ask you about, I mean, we don't have enough time, which we should have more time to discuss these important issues, but you also wrote and directed, as I mentioned, How to Survive a Plague, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. You inspired Soldier's Girl, this powerful story of a trans girlfriend of a soldier who was killed in an anti-gay attack. And I was living in Los Angeles, supportive of ACT UP at LA around the time that the government was not moving quickly or responsibly or sensitively on the drugs and response needed on, the growing AIDS crisis at that time. So I'm just interested in our viewers listening and hearing about the template of David Francis when it comes to these other elements of our story.
What has fascinated me in this trilogy of films is the kind of radical queer activism and how it's impacted history. How to Survive a Plague tells the story of how grassroots activism, mostly by people with HIV in the 80s and 90s, changed the way science is conducted, how that activism became an essential partner in the development of protease inhibitors and the 3 drug combinations that came out in 1996 that entirely transformed the HIV pandemic. The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson is about another group of people, equally outsiders and as far away from the levers of power as you can imagine. Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, uneducated transgender women, before there was a word for it, who were mostly living on the streets of New York, who became the partners with a small handful of people that got together after the Stonewall riots and began building the foundations for the modern LGBTQ movement. I've been trying to find the stories of our community that are really stories of civilization and stories that tell us how the world, the cultural and social and political world that we live in today is an inheritance from their work, and to lift them up into the canon of kind of great actors on the global stage where they belong, not just celebrated amongst us on Gay Pride Month, but celebrated by the generations to come.
Well, David France, director, writer, producer of How to Survive a Plague, Welcome to Chechnya, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. Your stories remind me a lot of a friend passed some time ago, Frank Kameny. Frank was a Mattachine Society here in Washington, D.C., I saw the other day that Google did a special Google Doodle in Frank's honor. I said, maybe we're getting somewhere. Maybe somehow our arts and cultural world are beginning to kind of elevate these stories. But I'm really, really grateful to you for finding these stories. Some of them are very uncomfortable, but very important and require political action. So, David, thank you so much for joining. I hope you'll come back, and thanks for your work. And everyone, watch Welcome to Chechnya on HBO. Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. What a day. A big thank you to our sponsors, Capital One and Philip Morris International, for their support of these conversations, to all of you attendees for joining us today. For those of you who missed any of these conversations, we're going to have a video from the event up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Happy Pride. Be well.